This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. We're going to continue in our series on the Bilderberg Group, the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. We're going to focus in on the fact that these powerful globalist elite organizations, which are essentially the shadow government behind the government of every major nation. In other words, they are the rulers behind the rulers. They are the puppet masters who pull the strings of the puppets who are our politicians and prime ministers. But their method of control consists largely of controlling each individual mind and turning it into a mass mind. So in other words, their primary method of controlling the people and making them their slaves, if you will, and I'm using the words of Aldous Huxley, an elite member of the invisible power structure of Great Britain, a famous intellectual who wrote Brave New World and lectured in the United States of America at the University of Berkeley on the existence. In other words, this was back in 1961, and he said, we already have started the scientific dictatorship, and he meant we started it decades and decades and decades ago before this 1961 convention he spoke at, where neuropsychiatrists from the attended the University of Berkeley for this conference. So the controlling of the mass population is through controlling the mind. Now that's, you can debate that with some of your friends. I wouldn't waste time unless they were open to the facts. I find a lot of people aren't open to the facts. Now, if they're open, sure, use the opportunity to discuss with them and educate them. Because the fact, this is not even really to even have to enter the arena where you're debating a truth that is so well established in mainstream media by the very people themselves who were the leaders of this globalist elite movement. In their own writings, they say exactly what they're going to do. So for somebody to come along and dismiss this as a conspiracy theory or however else they choose to dismiss it, it's idiocy personified, because the proof is overwhelming. If you look at the document, Rockefeller came out and said it. And he thanked all the major media by name, and not all of them by name, but the big ones by name, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others, for protecting his secret cabal. That's right, that's what the words that Rockefeller used, and hiding it from the masses of people around the world. He thanked the mainstream media for doing that, for covering it up. But he openly admitted what he was up to, as did Brzezinski, as did Huxley, as did Bertrand Russell, as did so many of the globalist elite. They hid nothing. And neither, by the way, does the Council on Foreign Relations. And in many respects, the Bilderberg Group isn't hiding everything they're doing. Their topics, their points of discussion reveal quite a bit. So it's not like you got to be a detective to find out what these people are saying. All you just got to do is get on the internet and look up what they said in their own words, in their own journals, the globalist elite's journals. So they control the world by dumbing the people down. Now, if you understand the basic facts of what has happened, and this is the irony, what I just described to you is so outrageous that if we had even a remotely honest media, but we don't even have a remotely honest media. We have a media that the mainstream media is totally owned, controlled by the globalist elite. And once you understand that, you will quit looking into the television screen hoping that some kind of illusory voice of truth is going to speak through it from the mainstream media. It's not going to happen. You don't get to the top in any of the big networks, including the conservative ones, unless you are on board with the CFR and are actually a member of the CFR. Okay, you don't have your position. Nobody in the entertainment industry, in the media industry, in the newspaper, internet publishing, television network, radio network, music industry, film, television, whatever. Nobody who has real power and real influence has their job unless they have, and they don't have to, it's not a formal thing. It's an unspoken rule largely. But nobody has their position unless they're smart enough, and I don't agree that this is a sign of intelligence. I think it's a sign of compromise myself, but they don't, they're not elevated to those positions of power, including presidents and vice presidents and senators and governors and on and on and on. They're not elevated into those positions of power for the most part, to a very large percentage, unless they have agreed to go along with the game plan of the globalist agenda. And they know they don't break rank. They don't cover they're not supposed to cover certain stories. Do you think they don't know that? No, that's not like unspoken agreement. It's like you would have to be a complete fool to walk into a major news organization and seriously and honestly cover the assassination of President Kennedy and actually dig where you're not supposed to dig, because you'd be fired. There's one particular guy on Fox, and I used to go on Fox constantly, but I stopped playing the game. And, I'm stumbling for words here because I have to be careful about how I explain it. I stopped playing the game. And on my website, which people could go to when I would make frequent Fox News network appearances on the biggest shows, I would have, detailed articles like on what I'm talking about now, and heavy-duty spiritual articles, and they don't like that. See, notice carefully that even in the conservative news networks, how many strong Bible-believing and prophecy-believing evangelical Christians do you see? Practically zero. Yeah, no. I'm not saying there aren't some politicians that, host shows that are known for being Christians, and I'm not saying that they're not Bible-believing Christians. They are. But you don't see any of these networks hiring an evangelical Christian who's a strong Bible-believing believer and a believer in prophecy. I can't think, on a big level, I can't think of anybody. All the people that are conservative are usually Catholics, overwhelmingly. And the Catholic doctrine is more acceptable to the secular media, because Catholics don't get into, and I'm not disparaging Catholics, but they don't touch Bible prophecy for the most part. So notice the group that is being excluded. Okay, so the media, which began to plan what H.G. Wells, the great science fiction writer, author of The Invisible Man, The Island of Dr. Moreau, Invaders from Mars, so many movies, I can't even remember them all. Just tons of that have been made into hit science fiction, blockbuster feature films. And H.G. Wells was the head of British intelligence during World War I. And he literally discipled Julian Huxley, who became the head of the Global Educational Division of the United Nations. And so they began indoctrinating the youth in every nation by standardizing the global curriculum. That's why when Huxley was head of UNESCO, which is the division of the United Nations which handles the global educational curriculum, they developed what was called Common Core, and this was decades ago. Now, notice that Common Core has resurfaced and is the standard in all the public schools across the United States. And if you want to do some homework that will really enlighten you, just look up, and don't go to a mainstream media website, which we're not going to tell you anything. You'll fall into the black hole of the universe. If you try to find true truth, or what Dr. Francis Schaeffer called final reality or true truth, and by final reality he meant, and he was the greatest evangelical theologian in the last 140 years or 150 years. Nobody has come along since his death anywhere near his stature. And Dr. Francis Schaeffer classified true truth as that truth which is really true above and beyond what people think truth may be. And he emphasized that truth is not based on your subjective experience. True truth is that truth which is true, and that truth which exists whether or not the entire global system is against it. And then, of course, he would reference it to Jesus Christ, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. So Jesus Christ is the truth. And there's not an equalness among gods in different religions. Only Christ died and resurrected from the dead. Only Christ is the Son of God. Now, Schaeffer also coined a term called final reality, because there's physicists and biologists and scientists and theologians and everybody people like Huxley were arguing about consciousness based on perception, and is our reality, is final reality only that which we see with our physical senses, hearing, touch, taste, etc. And then if we can't perceive it through our physical senses, then is it not reality? Is it a hallucination or something? Because when Schaeffer was writing his books, the theories of quantum physics and string theory had not exploded, because they dismantled the previously held scientific dogma upon which Marxist, communist, socialist thought and humanist thought was primarily built upon the foundation of what they believed to be truths, but they really weren't truths, but that they believed it with religious fervor. And they believed that mankind came here through evolutionary and evolutionary accident, random chance, and mankind randomly evolved over like 500 million years. Darwinian evolution. So science and much of our society is based on that false belief system, because on the basis of science's own empirical evidence, they have found something like 80 million fossils, and they've collected 80 million fossil records. And the entire theory of evolution rests upon this one empirical truth, which they have never proven to be true, and they have never found zero scientific evidence to prove that it's true. And therefore, the theory of evolution will forever remain a theory, because it cannot be validated by empirical scientific evidence, including the collection of over 80 million fossil records. And not in one of these fossil records do you see one species evolving into an entirely different species. Okay? Not once. They call it the missing link in evolutionary science. The missing link, because it means they make these graphic displays. You've seen the pictures of the tiny apes. It starts with the tadpoles, the tiny apes. The apes become more human, almost look like man, and then pow, there's man. And the implication is man is a direct descendant from the apes, and so on and so forth. Well, as interesting as that picture may be, that picture fails to show you that the picture itself is not accurate, because there's a missing link. There's no evidence. You see, there's plenty of evidence to show evolution or change within a species. But there is zero evidence to prove that there is evolutionary transformation that would cause one species to evolve into a distinct other kind of species. 80 million fossil records is not one piece of evidence. That's why they call it the missing link, because there is no evidence. There can't be any evidence because it never happened. And see, the whole Darwinian charade propped up by the mainstream media and the scientific establishment and the governments of this world is a classic story of the emperor has no clothes. And as most of you know, in that story, the emperor has no clothes. You know, if I forgot, it was some royal day of celebration. Okay? And so the king and all his assistants and his soldiers and everything, and they were privately dressing the king. And the king was going to then leave his castle, and he was going to be in a carriage with his mounted soldiers in armor before him and after him. And he was going to parade himself through the streets and wave and say hello, you know, to the people, and the people would cheer him on as he rode through the streets of his country. And it was expected that he would wear the finest of royal outfits. So he's in the room being dressed by his fashion designer and his assistants and associates. And his fashion designer, you know, is making the most elegant and royal outfit befitting of a king of his stature, and telling him how wonderful this clothing is and the material it's made of. And it turns out that the king can't see it. But he doesn't want to admit it, because then he would sound like a fool in front of this prestigious designer and all his associates. So he praises the outfit and finally convinces himself he's wearing this great outfit. And his associates do the same thing. Well, the reality is, you have like mob psychology here. Everybody has convinced themselves that the king is wearing this splendid outfit, fully clothed. And yet he goes into the streets and he's completely naked. And he gets into the open carriage with his troops, and he parades through the streets of his nation. And the people are cheering him like crazy, because nobody would dare admit publicly that the king was actually naked and not wearing anything. I mean, normally people would start laughing, but they didn't say a word because of fear, and also they didn't want to be the only one to suggest that the king was naked when everybody else was praising his outfit. And then this little boy comes by and notices the obvious, which is that the king is absolutely naked, not wearing a thing. And the little boy shouts out, "The king is naked! The king is naked!" before all the crowds. And all of a sudden that breaks the ice, and all the people start roaring with laughter and pointing at the king and laughing. And then his royal assistants begin laughing, and the king flees in rage and anger, because he realized he was just humiliated before his kingdom. But this illustrates the point of group psychology or mass psychosis, that it is possible to get an entire population to believe something as ridiculous as their king is. They're all pretending their king is clothed in the finest of royal outfits, when in reality he is totally naked from head to foot. And so they're applauding him based on his... That's group psychology. That's mass psychosis. You've seen that yourself. So have I. You've been at parties. You've been with groups of people. And some ridiculous idea or some ridiculous tale or notion is spoken of, which you know, and most of the people in the room know, is a flat-out lie, and it didn't happen or it couldn't have happened. And yet, for some reason... there's a certain number of people in the room that decide that it did happen. And so you all, to be polite, go along with it and pretend that whatever account or story they're talking about was true, like they said it was, even though you know it was absolutely not true. I mean, this is done all the time in the political world, in the social world, in so many ways. And it's what happens is a mob psychology takes over a group psychology where reality disappears due to psychological pressure. Now, people that are experts in scientific mind control, persuasion, indoctrination, and social engineering understand that when you're programming individuals and mass populations today, which is what the globalist elite through Bilderberg, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, etc., are doing, they are totally aware of the fact that they are exploiting heavily the vulnerability of adult and youth psychology in the fact that most human beings have an absolutely desperate need to be accepted by their peers, accepted by the group. And so the average person would rather believe lies. Well, this is true. It's just startling. But the average person would rather believe lies and be accepted by the group and be welcomed and thought of highly by the group. The average person, or I should say the overwhelming majority of people, would rather accept a lie in order to be esteemed by their peers than to believe the truth, which could potentially cost them acceptance by their peers and be rejected by their peers. And the fascinating thing about the psychological studies is that they reveal this. For most people, even if you add more and more proof that is irrefutable, that would hold up in any courtroom, that absolutely proves that what is being claimed is true, that will not in itself cause people to accept, most people, to accept the truth, because the price tag that they will have to pay, which is rejection by their peers, not being esteemed by their peers, is too heavy a price tag. So they will continue to believe the illusion or lie. And people that are social engineers, scientific mind control, persuasion, indoctrination, they all understand this and they use it. It's a powerful force. We all know what it's like because most of us went to high school, and usually there was an in-group in high schools, in junior high schools, and even in colleges, like the in-group, the in-crowd. Maybe you were part of the in-crowd. It doesn't matter. You would still have experienced it. And in order to even to qualify to be in the in-crowd, or the people that are considered the smarter people and the people that are going somewhere and stuff, you have to dress a certain way, you have to act a certain way, you have to talk a certain way, and you have to believe things the same way. That's how it works. So if you depart from the groupthink and you believe or dress or act in ways that have integrity, they may be totally, you may believe things that are absolutely scientifically true. But because that is not the commonly held group belief of the in crowd, you're going to be rejected. So many people during high school and college and stuff go along with the lies. They play the game because they would rather go along with the lies and play the game than be rejected. And the media is the same way, except the control with the mainstream media, which is very intense upon journalists and celebrity talk show hosts and stuff like that, is these people, they get the big position, the big title, or they may get national and international fame, book deals, and they get, depending upon how high up they are in the hierarchy, they get paid big bucks. And the superstars of media, like Oprah and others, get paid the mega bucks. Okay, but certain belief systems are conditional. Now, so that's a basis of mind control, and that's how the Bilderberg and the globalist elite control populations. But remember, mind control is a science, and it has been a science since, more than 200 years. It was a science that actually goes back to Mystery Babylon, as I said the other day, and all the major empires of the world. But specifically, Mystery Babylon was the origination point. And they didn't use the word science back then. So we have this funny notion that's not based on historical reality, that the sorcerers and magicians and stuff like that who advised the pharaohs and the emperors of these empires were somehow kind of like Las Vegas showmen, with tricks. No. That's what you see today for the most part, in Vegas and stuff, the magic shows and all that stuff. The sorcerers and the magicians and stuff and the wizards were not fairy tale people back in these empires. The most powerful people in the political governing systems of these ancient empires consulted these magicians, these astrologers, these prophets, these clairvoyants, etc. They consulted them on the most important issues of geopolitics, politics, domestic policy, how to deal with problems, weather, warfare, you name it, because they were considered the most credible source of information about the future, the past, and the present. And people have a very distorted idea of the power that these people had. They weren't flakes. Now, as the centuries rolled by, we now have what we claim to have, which was a scientific society, which was birthed, I don't know. It was actually starting to be born around the time of the United States of America and prior. It probably, a case could be made that the modern scientific age, the beginnings of it began to flower in the mid-1600s, let's say. And then science and technology, etc., came on. And so the scientific method was invented, and the scientific method was a method which said that a person's personal belief is not enough. We must have objective, measurable, verifiable, scientific evidence that's empirical. In other words, it can't be based on any belief. It has to be based on measurements, quantification, determination, things like that. Otherwise, we reject it. And Out of that, the communist philosophy was born. The humanist philosophy was born, because those philosophies claimed that they were purely scientific, and they rejected any notion of a supernatural universe or a spiritual world or a God or anything like that. That was totally rejected because they said we have no empirical scientific evidence to prove the reality of that. Well, the scientific method began to fail itself because they began to believe in evolution, totally apart from empirical scientific evidence, totally violating the scientific method. And then you had science investigating and opening, along with genetics and just about every other field of science. Physicists were discovering quantum physics and string theory, and they recognized that there weren't just the dimensions of perception. There were the dimensions beyond perception, like the belief in 13 dimensions by different dimensions by quantum physics and string theory, which allowed for a supernatural world and an invisible realm and scalar technology and all kinds of things. So now you have science believing in stuff that they can hypothesize, but they really can't prove, and yet they know it's real. So you look back on Marxism and stuff. Marxism really is an antiquated geopolitical economic system it is not based on science as it claims. Neither is humanism. Humanism and Marxism and communism are based on a religious belief. They're based on faith, not on facts. And even the Supreme Court has classified humanism as a religion, not as a scientific fact. So, back to Schaeffer, who coined the term final reality. Final reality is that reality which exists and is true. The final reality behind all the pseudo-realities of men's imaginations, of lies, distortions, ideologies, biases, etc., faulty research. There is final reality. And true truth is that truth which is truly true, not what people want it to be. In other words, all ways do not lead to God. Now, political correctness demands that we say that we believe all ways lead to God, because that's politically correct, and social engineering terms and scientific mind control terms like diversity, tolerance, etc., teach us that in order to be truly diverse, we must respect other religions and their beliefs that their God or their prophet is equally valid as a way to God. The problem with that is that you now destroy science and the empirical method, and you replace it with total personal subjectiveness based on an ideology, and you're making scientific conclusions, you're making theological conclusions, not based on facts, but based on mind control vocabulary and social engineering vocabulary. It doesn't matter whether or not it's objectionable to certain religions to hear that Jesus Christ is the only way to God. The Bible and the historical account of Jesus Christ in the New Testament and the Old Testament is the most powerful evidence of the reality of the infinite, personal, living God of the universe, the biblical God. The biblical account of creation, the biblical promise of the second coming of Jesus Christ, all the miracles that happen in the Bible that can be traced back in history, because you have these supernatural and angelic interventions in the middle of military battles, which changed the outcome of wars and changed human history forever. You have all these prophecies by the Old Testament prophets made thousands of years before Christ was born that the Messiah was going to be born of a virgin in Bethlehem, and they predict what is going to happen with him. The book of Daniel, where Daniel is making a supernatural prophetic interpretation to the king of Babylon in his Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks of Daniel, he talks about the 7-year tribulation period, and he gives a chronological timetable about the prophetic events happening in Israel, and then he predicts the years that Christ is ministering on the earth, and the fact that Christ will be crucified. And Daniel predicts the coming of the Antichrist and the abomination of desolation, and all kinds of time sequences with great mathematical precision. And many of these have already come true with the precision that the Bible predicts they will come in. Many historical events and geopolitical events that were predicted by the Bible have come true. In fact, the Bible has not ever made a prophecy that was ever proved to be false. The Bible's track record for accuracy in terms of prophetic predictions is 100% accuracy. And that is the only spiritual book among all the spiritual books of mankind which totally proves that it is the Word of God, not just the ideas of men. None of the other spiritual books, this is a fact, have any record of prophecy that has come true. Zero. They're fictional prophecies, or they make prophecies that don't come true. And one huge, and there's no way people could have made it up, because the Old Testament prophets, 4,000 years or more back in time, predicted that in the last days, in fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, the Jews would be supernaturally returned to the land of Israel by God. So after the horrors of the Holocaust and Hitler, the Jews had a second exodus where they took large boats and they sent large numbers of Jewish people from Nazi Germany who survived, and they were brought to Israel and Jerusalem, and the world powers gave the Jews the land of Israel, which at that time they gave them back the land of Israel after thousands and thousands of years. In 1948, the Jews were miraculously returned back to the land of Israel, as the Old Testament prophets had predicted. And it had been renamed Palestine. When the Jews returned, they gave it back its old name, which was Israel. And Israel is God's prophetic supersign. See, that alone, and the fact that Jesus Christ died and resurrected from the dead in front of all kinds of witnesses, airtight proof, all these totally accurate miracles and prophecies have come true, proving the Bible is final reality and true truth. This notion that man randomly evolved over 500 million years into what we are today, that we came from non-life to life, from molecules to tadpoles, whatever the genetic journey was, and that we somehow evolved into this place of a human being, that is the emperor has no clothes. And anybody with half a brain, or a quarter of a brain, or less, would be able to say the emperor has no clothes. The theory is false because there's no proof. But you see, employing the same mind control techniques, the average person, when they're presented with evidence proving that the theory of evolution is totally a farce, it's totally not true, and it's factually impossible for it to have happened, and that the biblical account, or even if you won't go the full way to the biblical account, if you simply embrace intelligent design, that is a theory that makes sense. But the globalist elite exploiting man's vulnerability to be accepted by their peers or their fellow scientists or their fellow professionals will go along saying that the king is wearing magnificent clothing even though he's naked. And they will maintain that evolution is true, despite the fact that now the evidence is overwhelming, even in the scientific community, that it's false. In fact, the only people that are promoting evolution as a scientific truth right now in an aggressive manner are the mainstream media, because whenever it comes down to lie or truth, despite what the mainstream media says, they are on the side of lies for the most part. So the mainstream media is promoting evolution, and the other institution that continues to promote evolution because it's essential. The belief in evolution is absolutely essential into the mind control indoctrination process of young people and adults going from grades K through university level. You've got to embed in them the lie through mind control that there is no personal God or biblical God, because it's important to kill God in people's minds and erase him, because none of the other mind control techniques can work if you have God in the equation. You see, it's the existence of the biblical God creating mankind, which says mankind has a purpose. Mankind, what it communicates to every little boy and girl is, you're here for a reason. You're here for a plan. God planned for you to be here. That we don't think about it much, because most of the people we talk to are in a state of semi-consciousness because they're brainwashed. But the internal ramifications for your identity, your behavior, your beliefs, and your morals, it's astronomical in size, and it's totally related to whether or not God exists or not. If God exists and there is a right or wrong, if God exists and there is a Ten Commandments, if God exists and there is a heaven and hell and death and resurrection, if God exists and there really is a right and a wrong, and his laws then should be followed, what it does, and see, the pastors of America have no idea. Most of them can't follow the flow of thought we just brought up. They can't connect the dots, and therefore they're weak and powerless. And God doesn't want them to be weak and powerless. God wants them to be mighty men of God, not cowards. But as long as they believe the lie, they will be weak and impotent, which most of them are. And it's not a disparaging. It's when you believe a lie, you are turned into a slave. The Lord says that in his word. It's the truth that will set you free. That means set free from what? Set free from being a slave. Set free from captivity. It's the truth, not believing in a lie. It's believing the truth that will set you free. And evangelical Christians wrap it in a tiny little box with a tiny little bow, like a little gift under a pagan Christmas tree, and they try to make it just about, the Bible's talking about truth, but just about salvation. Baloney. The Bible's talking about all truth. including salvation, the truth of God's word, the truth of creation, on and on and on and on. But the whole mind control apparatus is shattered to pieces. The chains of scientific mind control, which produce scientific slavery, are shattered. Because you are only able to manipulate and dominate somebody's brain when you first give them a false identity, when you tell them there is no God, there's only the super government, Big Brother, the group mind. When you tell them there is no right or wrong, then you can destroy the family unit, which the family unit must be destroyed because scientifically it is the family unit and marriage and having children and a Christian family raising children, which causes a society to be strong, healthy, economically rebound, etc., etc. All of a society's problems are rooted in the disintegration of the family unit. The communists know this. Christians don't seem to get it. That's why they target the family. That is the purpose of the widespread promotion of immorality by the scientific elite who are behind the mind control process. They promote pornography, they promote indecency, they promote perversion of every kind. I mean, it's always some new form of immorality. You know, the 50 Shades of Grey movies and books franchise. It's always that will, lose its energy and something else will come to replace it. And see, the issue has nothing to do with what people think it has to do. People think this has to do with choices and personal decisions and all that. The globalist elite could care less about that. All of these things, including feminism, are just pawn pieces on a chessboard designed to smash apart the family unit. That's all it's about. All this discussion of sexuality in our society is not really what it's about. It's really about destroying a family unit, because the family unit is an institution that God created, and it is probably the most powerful psychological force in creating a society of productive, happy people, okay, who are not vulnerable to scientific mind control. So you've got to break down the basic biblical truths. You've got to destroy them. That's why they target Christianity. In their own words, both communism and the globalist elite, when you read their manuals and their books, the Frankfurt School, which came up with the whole political correctness movement. By the way, the Frankfurt School, which you can read about in my book extensively, Conquering the Matrix, and you can read about extensively in my book, Mass Awakening. The Frankfurt School began in the 1925 in Germany. It was a bunch of KGB, which was Russian military intelligence, that was in existence right after the Communist Revolution began in Russia in 1917. And this school of communist revolutionaries who masqueraded as academic professors moved to Germany, where they, quote, claimed that their role was to incite and initiate communist Marxist revolutions in Western nations and societies like America, Great Britain, European Union nations, and other Western nations. But they said, the approach they used in China and Russia, which was, bombs, bullets, slaughtering people, killing 200 million people here, 200 million people there, that would not be effective in the United States of America. And how they would bring about a communist revolution in America would be through scientific mind control. And they specialized on programming, indoctrination, persuasion, propaganda, and scientific mind control, which would be implemented through the media, film, television, newspapers, magazines, books, radio, and words and images that people used. So they created the political correctness concept, and then they create all the words, the mind control words within the political correctness movement, like hate speech, like the propaganda purposes behind the terms diversity, tolerance, global warming, climate change, and on and on and on. These are mind control words. Okay? Now, what they've done is they've changed the consciousness and the thinking. Think of it this way. The purpose of a mind control word is that you hear it often enough, then the people around you start to believe it and act on it. You respond to the peer pressure of your friends, your professors, society, as well as you constantly hearing the word repeated again over and over again in the mass media. And then you become brainwashed and you begin to accept and believe and think on the basis of these terms. So if you're guilty of hate speech, it's because you were attacking or being negative or being derogatory against certain groups, ideas, peoples, or whatever. Okay, and just like George Orwell's Big Brother used the term thought reform. Thought reform was commonly used and still is today by the communists and Marxists in our university system. So you get people to think only along the terms of the principles of communism by controlling their minds. So they're afraid to be guilty of hate speech. They're afraid of not respecting diversity or being tolerant. And, people are terrified. First, people were terrified to be against climate change. What happened first is people were terrified to be against global warming. And then you had Al Gore, who is a member of the globalist elite. That's why he floats around, getting elected or appointed vice president, one of the most powerful positions in the world. That's why Al Gore is at all the key Bilderberg meetings, the United Nations meetings. And Al Gore's assignment among the globalist elite, of which he's one of the highest leaders, is to promote and indoctrinate the masses into believing that we have a global warming threat and a climate change threat. But they had a big problem. Global warming and climate change is nothing more than a pretext for total domination and control of people, societies, and resources by the globalist elite. It's just a scam. It's an excuse to put in smart meters, an excuse to regulate how much gas you use, water, heat, air conditioning. It's an excuse to ration the amount of gasoline you use, how big a car, how big a home you use. It's a pretext for controlling and dominating you. And if you're still capable of thinking a logical, coherent thought, and if you've not been dumbed down, you can see clearly the hidden agenda behind these mind control words like global warming and climate change. The entire purpose is to restructure society using the excuse of an illusory crisis or a manufactured crisis that, the world is, in an apocalyptic sense, going to come to an end through an environmental catastrophe. And the only way we can spare planet Earth is if we lower our standard of living. We live in tiny houses and apartments. We drive tiny cars, or better yet, we strictly use public transportation. We all choose to live in small spaces, in cities. We don't live out in nature, in the country. We all voluntarily accept a lower standard of living. Maybe don't even have a car or anything like that at all. We just ride bicycles. Now, what you have to understand is this is all a very clever way of conquering a people and making them slaves without them knowing it. In other words, what you're really doing is you're using climate change and global warming as an excuse for more and more mass surveillance, smart meters and other computerized devices to monitor your gas usage, your electrical usage, your water usage, and all kinds of other things that should be private matters. Then they lower your standard of living. Smaller dwelling places. Okay, the next thing you know, if you look at it objectively, you now will have hundreds of millions of Americans and people in the European Union whose lifestyles will be exactly similar to the lifestyles of people in third world nations, like, parts of Malaysia and parts of Vietnam and parts of, a lot of these nations where everybody's riding a bicycle. They lived in crammed apartments. They have little or no energy. They have no freedom. And it's the classic third world lifestyle, which we see on television all the time when people visit these impoverished nations. Well, that's exactly what they're doing methodically in the United States and Europe. But they're doing it they're brainwashing the people to go along with it and to be happy about it, because that way there's no resistance. And that's the purpose of scientific mind control. So what they're doing, and now, by the way, you can't call this a conspiracy theory unless your brain has been dialed down. If you have a narrow bandwidth brain and you're a low information person, you're a perfect candidate for mind control, because you see all of these dynamics are integrated. If you observe the decline in the last 50 years, the significant decline in the standard of living of the American working class, middle class, European Union middle class, working class, the middle class is disappearing, and the standard of living of the working and middle class in the U.S. and around the world, but especially the U.S., is continuing to be transferred to third world nations, while our nation keeps getting lower and lower. So the earnings, the kind of houses you can buy, your standard of living is lower and lower, but you're being mind controlled into loving it because you're helping the environment. Okay, so it's happening economically, it's happening in your brain through brainwashing, and now you accept the mass surveillance for numerous reasons, but it's all based on lies. It's all based on propaganda. It's all based on mind control. It's not based on reality. And this is why you have to understand whether you are under mind control or not. And that's why I suggest very strongly that you get a copy of Conquering the Matrix. You don't have to get that book. You can get some other book if you can find it. But the point is, if you don't understand the process that you're being put through and your children are being put through, then you are going to be a slave. And God never created you to be a slave. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. It's important that you spread this message far and wide, and you can visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us for all kinds of free information, articles, videos, our new Roku Channel, Paul McGuire Ministries, thousands of pages of articles and pictures, the archives of the Paul McGuire Report, and all kinds of free stuff. So visit paulmcguire.us, and we'll be back in a second. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. This program, as well as many of the programs we do, would help somebody you know immensely, enormously. But the only way they're going to be able to gain access to it, especially due to the vastly increased hidden computerized censorship going on in the internet, which is, most people don't realize how hot and heavy it's coming down. But if you allow the Lord to speak to you and he puts the names of people or groups of people that need to hear this message, then you can act as an ambassador for Christ. In a sense, you're acting as an evangelist, just doing a different function. You're taking this information and you're using your ability to go around the censorship and feed it directly to individuals that need to hear it. And it's truth that will set people free. So visit paulmcguire.us. We have all kinds of social media icons you can use to spread the message. Now, back to Aldous Huxley's statement. I consider this statement the most important statement of just about anything to do with globalism and mind control, etc., because it sums it all up so clearly. Aldous Huxley gave a speech to a convention of neuropsychiatrists at the University of Berkeley in 1961, where he said, in a truly effective scientific dictatorship, men and women will learn to love their slavery. And then Huxley added, and not only that, they will not even be aware that they are slaves. Now, that was powerful, man. I mean, that was like detonating a thermonuclear bomb in the consciousness of the people in the room, unless they already were in on it, which is highly possible. What he was saying was, he was telling them, if they didn't already know, I suspect a lot of them already knew or they wouldn't have been invited. He was telling them that, hey, look, this world has been run and is being run now by a secret scientific dictatorship that controls Europe, the European Union, America, and the majority of the nations in the world. And the number one thing you need to understand is that first there is a scientific dictatorship ruling the world, and this whole fairy tale that it's politicians and prime ministers that the people elect and all the rest of that stuff, that the lies that they promote on television and the mainstream media, that's a fantasy. That's not true, Huxley was saying. We control, the globalist elite, we control their minds, and because we control their minds, we control the world. And the way we do it is we use the educational system and have been using the educational system as far back as at least 1917. We've been using the educational system to brainwash, to indoctrinate, to use social engineering, and to use mind control on hundreds of millions of American children who are now adults, etc., and all around the world. And one of the primary things we do in this mind control process is we brainwash them into thinking there's no such thing as a scientific dictatorship, and that even though their role in society is an ever-increasing role of slavery, that they've lost the vast degrees of their freedom, and they are actually being used by us as slaves. We have so effectively controlled their minds that they're not even aware that they're slaves. They're all running around thinking they're independent, individualistic, independent thinkers who are free. That's what they believe. And Huxley thought, I'm sure, this was quite humorous, because they're brainwashed into thinking they're free. In actuality, they are slaves, but they don't even know it. And on top of that, Huxley was telling the scientists there that, hey, we've even gone so far as that they actually they don't even know they're slaves, and they actually love the duties they have to perform as slaves. That's what scientific mind control is about. Now, if you think about that soberly, and you focus in on that for a moment, because you see, there's an automatic thing that happens whenever somebody is exposed to a truth, like the truth I just said to you verbally. The mind, because it's been so heavily programmed by scientific mind control, immediately gets sleepy, tired, fatigued, distracted, angry, annoyed, goes into denial of a conspiracy theory, gets distracted, very tired, or whatever. What's happening is your mind has been so heavily controlled by scientific indoctrination that when you're presented with truthful, accurate facts about the way the world really works, about your real function in this world, it's so earth-shattering to you that it places you into cognitive dissonance. You disassociate from reality, and the programming in you begin to crash like the computer in your inner being, because you're an overload. You can't handle it, and they don't want you to accept this information. They don't want this information to be activated in you, because then you would be set free. So you're programmed to shut down. Okay? And that's what you're experiencing. Many of you experienced it when I said it. You weren't aware, second by second and minute by minute, of what was happening to you physiologically and psychologically as I was telling you the truth about and reality about scientific mind control. But if you're honest and you review the last 10 minutes, not counting the earlier part of the program, if you're honest and you review the last 10 minutes, and you just took notes and you made a little graph with a pen, you would notice that each of you went through probably 10 different distinct phases of intense but subtle at the same time emotional, psychological feelings and experiences. You went through disorientation, you went through denial, you went through conspiracy theory, you went through fatigue without realizing it, you went into heavy sleepiness without realizing it. You started to fade mentally, and your mind and your ability to be analytical, to remember it, and to understand it and overcome it, all of that began to shut down. And all of that is evidence of a methodical stages programmed into your mind of what you as a slave are supposed to do internally when you're presented with truth that could set you free from this slave mentality that's been programmed into you. I know this is heavy stuff, man. I understand that. I got that. But it's heavy stuff to be free. See? It's heavy stuff to be free. Now, the globalist elite, Bilderberg, that's what they're all about. That's what these groups are really about. That's why, this really should be a no-brainer, but we're dealing with a belief system that's so embedded in people that they can't, unless they want to, and unless they're willing to ask God for help and the power of the Holy Spirit, they can't seem to break free from it. So, these groups like Bilderberg and CFR and the other books, but not books, they're the groups that are the shadow government, the deep state, etc. So, for example, in this year, WikiLeaks released classified material exposing how the Council on Foreign Relations controls all mainstream media. Now think about that. The Council on Foreign Relations, or the globalist elite, control most all mainstream media. That means just about every mainstream media person, outlet, organization is under the total control of the Council on Foreign Relations of the globalist elite. They're not free. They're pumping out to you mind control, social engineering, okay, 24/7. And here's a quote by the author's article, Matt Agarist. He says, "A single organization controls almost everything you see, hear, and read in the media, and they've been handpicking your leaders for decades," Agarist continues. "It's no secret that over the last 4 decades, mainstream media has been consolidated from dozens of competing companies to only 6. Hundreds of channels, websites, news outlets, newspapers, and magazines, making up 99% of all media, is controlled by very few people, giving Americans the illusion of choice." Now, this is what you have to know, because this is where your friends are. People don't think mind control is real because they have been given the illusion of choice. They don't have real choices. They're programmed to accept a fantasy world where they are given the illusion of choices. A classic illusion of choice would be, we're going to give you a choice of voting between a Democratic candidate for president or a Republican candidate for president. That's an illusion of choice. And there are many other illusions, like whether you're going to choose to watch this television network for your news or that television network. Illusion of choice. Okay. According to a former military major, Todd Pierce, he says the CFR is a key cog in the hub of Washington think tanks promoting endless war. Think tanks act as primary provocateurs using psychological suggestiveness to create a false narrative of danger from some foreign entity with the objective to create paranoia within the U.S. population that is under imminent threat of attack or takeover. And then what he's really saying is that the Bilderberg Group, the CFR, and the Trilateral Commission are employing a domestic form of psychological warfare against the American people. That's how they're in control. Now, before Trump was elected, he's not a member of the CFR. But the previous 4 presidents, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama were all members of the Council on Foreign Relations, with the majority of everybody in their administration being Council on Foreign Relations members. Even Trump, although he himself is not a member of the CFR, at least publicly, many people in his administration are members of the CFR. I guess that's a trade-off you have to do to stay in power, but there's always a price with a trade-off, because the globalist elite do not like Donald Trump, because his agenda is everything that they're trying to destroy. And you want to know what that agenda is? Let me just give you a few little bullet points so you have an idea where the globalist elite are taking us, because they don't hide it. First of all, they're going to take us to a one world government, one world religion, and one world economic system. The very thing that God came down and judged in Genesis 11. This is what the Bilderberg Group, CFR, Trilateral Commission, and the globalist elite are taking us exactly to the place where Lucifer took the people when they built the Tower of Babel, and then they established ancient Babylon, which was the world's first one world government, one world economic system, and one world religion. So God judged it. Okay? And then God warned what would happen if mankind ever did this again. And we are doing it again. This is a huge prophetic sign. We are doing the very thing once again. It's not going to come in the future. The one world government, the one world religion, and the one world economic system is being put together as fast as it can right in front of our eyes. We're already in the assembly process. And Babylon is going to return, as is predicted, and is specifically predicted in Revelation chapter 17, Revelation 18, Revelation 16, where it talks about a charismatic world political leader named the Antichrist, who will rule the one world government. He's called the first beast. The second beast is the first beast is the Antichrist. The second beast is the false prophet who controls the first one world economic system and one world religion. Or, as Henry Kissinger says, the New World Order. And you have to understand, if you're a Christian, that the New World Order is a counterfeit of the kingdom of God, in which Jesus Christ will head up the kingdom of God. The Antichrist, or Lucifer, heads up the New World Order. Now, their goal is to destroy each person's identity and program the people to accept one set of humanistic and often anti-Christian universal values. Their goal is a centralized control of world populations by mind control, which means the globalist elite are controlling world public opinion. Their goal is to create this new world order with no middle class. Now, I want you to hear that. Their words, their agenda is to create a new world order with no middle class. Only rulers and servants, or masters and slaves, or god kings and slaves. And of course, no democracy. But they understand that people would go into a full-on revolution if they knew what the true plans were of these globalist elite. So they pay off these sucker-punched celebrities to promote the global government, the global order, the New World Order. And you go back to John Lennon. I mean, somebody who was into scientific mind control and the rest of that hypnotic stuff obviously was using John Lennon. John Lennon had to have had a handler. I have a suspicion of who it was. I'm just not going to mention it at the moment. Because he comes out with this song, which is like a word-for-word propaganda song for the creation of a new world order that the globalist elite want. And the name of that song is Imagine. And every time you watch the New Year's Eve ball go down on Times Square, the crowds are singing in Times Square and all over the world John Lennon's song. Imagine there's no heaven, there's no countries to die for, there's no war, there's no money, there's no religion, there's no heaven, and the world will be as one. I mean, John Lennon is specifically hitting every bullet point of the goal of the New World Order. Okay? Now, do you think he became one of the greatest stars of rock and roll just because he was a talented musician? No. The New World Order and the globalist elite, they look, this is going to be a heavy thing for a lot of people to come to terms with. They have evolved the science of mind control technology and MK Ultra and other forms of mind control technology to such an extent that they sift through the world's populations looking for young people who meet certain qualifications that they can train, influence, program with scientific mind control to perform a specific role in bringing about and promoting their globalist society. So a lot of people who are at the very top of the game in television, broadcasting, in movies, actors, directors, superstars, music superstars, other super celebrities, they have been, many of them have, well, notice that all of the ones who are in the superstar category have basically the same belief system in every area. And it's the belief system of the globalist elite. They were recruited, most of them, in childhood and indoctrinated and developed and programmed to promote this world order. That's why they got promoted. They didn't get promoted just on their talent. Now think of the biggest names in television talk show hosts right now. Think of the big names, the household word names. I would suggest to you that a disturbing percentage of those individuals have been exposed to one form or another of some kind of indoctrination mind control process. Or at the very least, they're aware that they have to say things, believe things a certain way in order to retain their power. I believe John Lennon was definitely one of those individuals within the music industry, as there are others. Some conspicuously die. So John Lennon is singing this song. It's an anthem to the New World Order. He was a total hypocrite. He said, imagine knows no religion, yet he was reading books by Edgar Cayce and deeply involved in the occult, all which is a religion, privately. He was a heroin addict, okay, an ongoing junkie, and he had, at the time of his death, over $500 million in his bank account, which back when he died was a far larger fortune than it was in today's money. And so he gets his position, and then he must have done something that bothered them. He must have tried to break free in his mind. Something happened. I can't tell you what happened because I don't know. All I know is that mysteriously they pull the plug on John Lennon's life, which happens often, it seems. So, you have Angelina Jolie, you have Brad Pitt, you have Bono, and others who take on like John Lennon's role, singing the praises of this new world order. But these people are so dumbed down, so indoctrinated, that they haven't even read the bullet points that I'm reading to you. Because I think that most of them are programmed. I wouldn't even say naive. I think they're brainwashed. And so, how else could they get behind this program? In this New World Order that the Bilderberg Group wants, they want a zero-growth society without prosperity or progress, only greater wealth and power for the rulers, which is what we have seen economically during the last 40 to 50 years. Manufactured crises and perpetual wars. Notice purely from the standpoint of creating a mind control consciousness, that what your ears and eyes see via television and other forms of media, the internet, etc., continually, what you're seeing 24/7 is chaos, insanity, shock, depravity, horror, constantly. And it just keeps, school shootings, this, that, the other. It's constant hysteria, constant madness. That is a tool in mind control to keep you psychologically off balance so that you can be programmed. God bless you. I'm Paul McGuire. Help spread this news, this program far and wide. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us.